Today, in current events from a Christian perspective, a cathedral in Washington removes racist stained glass windows in order to replace them with BLM-inspired activist stained glass windows. So that's nice. I miss those old-timey stained glass window days where, they'd have pictures of Jesus and stuff. Meanwhile, now you have a new way to track whether your church is quote-unquote safe for the LGBTQ AAIP hashtag ++ squiggly emoji community via an online database and rating system. I'm sure this won't create terrible religious persecution. After all, when has putting people on a list to determine whether or not they're good or bad ever created a tyrannical murder state? All this and more today. I'm Matt Odegaard, and this is Church Public. Welcome back to Church Public. As always, I'm your host, Matt Odegaard, and I really appreciate you stopping by today. We've got a few things to get to today, and I just want to thank you for spending a little bit of time with me. If you haven't already, you can hit all the like and subscribe and share and update buttons and those kinds of things. If you want to leave a review, that's fine too. Just want to get the word out so that people understand how to live out your faith in this wild and crazy world that we're currently living in. I bring you current events from a Christian perspective so that you can learn how to live out that faith. That seems to be the vehicle that works for us, at least at this point. So we're going to do that today. We're going to look at a few things. And if you haven't already, if you are listening on audio and you want to go check out the video, you can go to churchpublic.com to check that out. All right. Oh man, there's a lot going on. But I just grabbed a few today because I think they're going to be good. And I want to go a little bit deeper into them as we figure out what is going on in this world and what it means for us from a Christian perspective. First, I didn't even put this in the intro, but felt like it was worth sharing. I don't do much talking about Ukraine. I have some thoughts, but I'm not going to share all of them today. What I want to do instead is talk about the ambassador. Apparently, Marina, I'll probably mess up this name, but Abramovich has been appointed as the ambassador to Ukraine after the last guy. Again, if you're just listening, I'll show you a picture. The last guy who does dress like a girl was let go for some weird behavior. Again, I'm not going to get into all of that weird behavior. There were some threats involved, apparently. We'll just see how it goes. But that guy is right out. So now we're not doing that anymore. Now we have Marina Abramovich, who, so here's the article from the UK Telegraph. Zelensky asks Marina Abramovich to be ambassador for Ukraine. She's an artist, and she will lend her voice to help rebuild schools and other things in the country. Now, I've clipped this picture a little bit because the rest of the picture is kind of gross because she's holding, I guess it's a goat head or I don't know. Basically, she's holding the Satan horns because she, I don't know if I say allegedly, I'm not sure what to do here, but apparently, according to her own words, she is actually a witch or at least practices witchcraft or something. So this ambassador is not like the last one. Again, a guy who dressed like a girl. No, this one is actually a witch. I'm sure this is all going to turn out great. That's really all I want to talk about that story. I look at current events from a Christian perspective, and it should be fairly obvious that having a self-proclaimed witch or person who practices witchcraft is not particularly Christian. If you missed that, I shouldn't have to. I mean, there are plenty of verses in ye old Bible that talk about why witchcraft is bad. I've talked about that many times before. If you need some of those verses, you email me or message me on the socials at Church Public, and I'll send you plenty of verses for that. All right, coming back towards America now, we go to Washington, D.C. The Washington National Cathedral is replacing some stained glass windows with really BLM-inspired themes via Fox News. The Washington National Cathedral unveiled several racial justice-themed stained glass windows this past weekend. And here's just some pictures of the old ones. They look like regular stained glass windows. Now, they do contain some interesting material. We'll talk about that material in a moment. I'll start here and then we'll come back around at the end here. But I remember the days when stained glass windows in the Middle Ages were for telling the stories of the Bible. Which these don't either. But apparently these windows were too racist and too terrible, so they had to be replaced. So these windows were replaced, and they were replaced with for new windows depicting people of color, this is reading from the article, people of color marching in protest while holding signs that read, quote, fairness and, quote, no foul play. The windows, I actually have some pictures of that. Here are some of those pictures. If you're not watching, go to churchpublic.com. You can check this out. And here's just a person installing those windows. Says no foul play, fairness, etc., etc. So the previous windows, now to talk about that, they contained Robert E. Lee, General Robert E. Lee, and General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, whom you may have heard about from the Civil War. And that's controversial, for sure. Reading from the article, quote, the Windows artist Carrie James Marshall spoke at the dedication ceremony, saying, today's event has been organized to highlight one instance where a change of symbolism is meant to repair a breach of America's creation promise of liberty and justice for all. Marshall, a MacArthur Foundation fellow whose body of work centers on depicting the lives of black people, added that his windows, quote, reinforce these ideals and aspirations embodied in the cathedral structure and its mission to remind us that we can be better and do better as we did yesterday, today, end quote. That was kind of a weird way to say it, but I'm going to go ahead and interject a question here from a Christian perspective, because that's what we do. Our cathedrals, you know, the houses of worship, house of God, a church, is that space mainly for, quote, reminding us that we can be better and do better than we did yesterday, end quote? Maybe, right? So if you're saying we should follow Jesus and do what he says, then yes, of course, we should be better and do better. Of course, you could also point to Jesus himself and Ephesians and Paul and all these other places that remind us that we can't do any of this on our own, Romans, right? That we need God and his grace through faith, and that's the only way we actually can come to God. So is it about being better, or is it about living holy because God is holy, out of 1 Peter and out of Leviticus, because that's really how we are to live when we have the Spirit of God in us. But anyway, I digress a little bit. So when you're saying we should just be better or do better, are you saying that we should live up to who Jesus is? Maybe. If that's what you're saying, okay, I like that. But is that what is being said here? Is that what the windows represent here? Or is it more like the woke progressive talking point to quote unquote be better? Because the Marxist ideal is the ultimate future is that everybody just gets better eventually. That's a question without an answer at this point, though we could probably guess. Continuing on in this article, at the time, Hall acknowledged that the original windows, some of which contained images of Confederate flags, again, shown here if you're not watching, these are, this is Stonewall and General Lee. They were installed in 1953 to be a mark of reconciliation between the North and South following the war. However, he expressed that times had changed, which required the replacement. Quote, while the impetus behind the windows installation was a good and noble one at the time, the cathedral has changed, and so has the America it seeks to represent. There's no place for the Confederate battle flag in the iconography of the nation's most visible faith community, Dean Hall declared. Now, on the one hand, all I hear here is they just are floating along with whatever the times are. They're just saying, hey, I'm just going to do whatever is going on in the current culture and live according to that, which, of course, is not a great way to live. I think I've got a good quote here from William Ralph Inge, professor of divinity at Cambridge from long ago. He said, if you wed the spirit of the age, you'll find yourself a widower in the next. I think that's a pretty excellent and apt quote here. So at one point in this cathedral's history, they thought they needed to fly along with the spirit of the age in the Confederate spirit, or the spirit of at least connecting North and South and reconnecting them. Now they're flying along with the spirit of the age, saying they need to have these protest stained glass windows or something like that. Now, I can also say I'm no fan of the Confederacy, and perhaps including Jackson and Lee initially was not the right choice. I wasn't alive to say. But here's the write-up of when the windows initially went in, because I was curious. Why did these windows get put in the first place? Via the Washington Post, John Kelly writes an article in 2013 talking about just this thing. Jackson is described as, quote, walking humbly before his creator, whose word was his guide, the word of Christ, of course. Lee is described as a, quote, servant of God, leader of men, general-in-chief of the armies of the Confederate statues, whose compelling sense of duty, serene faith, and unfailing courtesy mark him for all ages as a Christian soldier without fear and without reproach, end quote. Now, I know they were part of the Confederacy, and we could talk a long time about how that was bad. However, that description of a Christian man sounds pretty good. Again, I'm no fan of the Confederacy. I'm just saying. So then, at the time, Cathedral spokesman Richard Weinberg said he's not aware of any criticism of the niches. Again, these pictures that used to hang there until very recently. He said, quote, in its iconography, the cathedral depicts not only religious history, the story of Christianity, which I'm a fan of, but also tells the story of American history. The Civil War, he says, is part of American history. American history includes good and bad things, end quote. He also pointed out that not too far away from Lee and Jackson is a bay dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, which is nice. Weinberg went on to say, of course, Lincoln was on the right side, the winning side. That is a quote from him. Now, he went on to say, I don't think, and this is the time at 2013, so 10 years ago now, he said, I don't think the stained glass windows should be pried from their frames, which of course they just were. That's my addendum. Continuing on. But I'm not comfortable with the unquestioning context in which they're presented. How about adding some sort of sign that explains the window's history and acknowledges the overwhelming oddness of treating these two flawed men like saints? Now, I just have to pause here and again interject. Even Lincoln was not himself a saint. So why? What are we doing with these windows? That's my bigger question here. I'm not even going to show again what's going on them. You can go look it up, or you can back up the video. Why are we putting stained glass windows in churches that depict people like this anyway? Now, I know there's a whole history of iconography and other things, and I'm not going to get into all of that church history and schism at this point. However, my question stands, why do you want a stained glass window? What are you saying with this stained glass window? If you go back a long way into the Middle Ages, church art was used for teaching, primarily. When people could not read or write necessarily, they would look at these windows and know stories from the Bible. I think that's a valuable use of this art. In the Middle Ages, this was used for teaching. The subjects painted in the windows gave context to scriptural passages. I can tell you, because I am personally looking at this all the time, we're not far off from the Middle Ages in terms of biblical literacy. Nobody knows anything about the Bible. Nobody reads their Bible, and those that do don't even believe what it says. Now, I know that's an overgeneralization, but only by a little bit. Just ask someone when the last time they read their Bible was, who doesn't go to church regularly. It's almost never. Even some that do go to church don't read their Bibles very much. I hope since you're listening to this that you do. I encourage you to. I would encourage you to do it every day. I think it's that valuable. But perhaps we need to go back to stained glass windows telling Bible stories, since no one really understands who Jesus is right now anyways. I think this is all just a story to remind us that this culture is just going to culture. They're just going to go and do crazy things all the time, like putting stained glass windows in of Confederate soldiers or presidents or protest signs. Maybe the churches should focus more on what's in the Bible. But hey, what do I know? Speaking of churches, let's go across the pond to hear about the latest in the church ranking systems. Now, I knew this is coming. I knew it's been coming for a long time, but now it is here. The LGBTQ AAIP # ++ $squiggly emoji ranking of churches, so that you can know how quote unquote safe you are while worshiping God. You know, God, the holy creator who you can't actually stand before without the blood of Jesus covering you. But anyway, now you can know if your other church members are safe, I guess, or something. Anyway, we're going to Oxford at this point. Now, the Oxford Safe Churches Project. So this project, the Oxford Student Faith Action, published a Safe Churches report, as you can see by this screenshot here. Apparently, this is a rating of LGBTQ friendliness, according to them. This, I think, has been in the mix for a long time. I am not surprised that it's here. And no, it's not here in America, but it is here in England. And I would say what comes to England is not long for coming to America. That's just the way things work. It has for generations, hundreds and hundreds of years at this point. So we have this rating system for churches in regards to how quote unquote friendly or quote unquote safe they are to this LGBT cult. Note, as we'll see later, these churches did not sign up for this. They didn't have the option of opting out of this. They were kind of secret shopped, if you will, and included in this. Kind of like a restaurant review online, except these churches were rated with people with an agenda. So here's the story. Quote, Oxford students have rated local churches based on how safe they are for gay and transgender Christians. The student awarded scores of 1 to 5 after analyzing sermons and blog posts and speaking to worshipers. Jane Ozanne, an LGBTQ rights campaigner who sits on the Church of England's General Senate, said she hoped the exceptionally important project would be, in her words, replicated by grassroots groups across the country, end quote. Now, as I pointed out, it's very clear they did this and they want to keep it going across their country, as they're mentioning here in the UK, and it wouldn't be surprising to come here to America very soon. They are keeping score. This will be across America in no time. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is the direction we're going, especially with online reviews of every restaurant you can go to and every place you can go to. Of course, churches are going to be on this list. There are already lists of what churches are and what they do. This is just going to be a more specific one, and within the scope, within the boundaries of quote unquote safety for this certain community. There will likely be websites and apps and reviews and all kinds of things of your church. And this is, make no mistake, no matter the size of your community, you and your church will have to make decisions about what to do in this situation because it's going to come. It's going to happen. What are you going to do when they give your church a certain number? And we'll go through some of the numbers in a moment of this rating. It may or may not be the same thing, and that doesn't even matter because the reality is this kind of rating system or something like it is going to be in churches across the country in America before you know it, and you're going to have to decide what you want to be a part of. You're going to have to make decisions about what to do in this situation and how compliant you want to be or how silent you want to be. You don't really have a choice in this. It's going to happen. And this isn't about being silent, and it isn't even about being against the agenda. You're going to have to say you give total and complete support of all of the behaviors and all of the relationships and all of the LGBT agenda. You're not going to be able to say, well, we just don't want to talk about it. That's not going to matter, as I'll show you in a moment via some of this report. With modern media, social media, etc., all over the place, this activist community is going to spread this really far, really fast, and you're going to see it sooner than you probably think. I liken it to kind of a backwards Santa, where they're checking into who's naughty and who's been nice, and they are most definitely making a list. So the student newspaper at Oxford University said in this Oxford newspaper report by Etienne Baker, she said, quote, the Oxford Safe Churches Project, run by a coalition of LGBTQ plus organizations and the churches in Oxford, have published their first faith report titled Attitudes to Queer Christians in Oxford Churches. The report, on last Friday 22nd, uses a quote-unquote traffic light system to rank the LGBTQ inclusivity of churches in Oxford. Again, this is in a very small subset, but it won't stay there for long. St. Eldad's Church and St. Ebbe's Church, both located next to Pembroke College in the center of Oxford, are ranked in the lowest rate of inclusivity and have a bunch of evidence suggesting they have displays of homophobia and transphobia. So that's actually a quote from this article. The headline is Attitudes Towards Queer Christians in Oxford Churches. But interestingly, in here, do I have a picture of it? Let's see. I don't know if you can see it in this. I'll put this up again. You can't see it in this picture. So right under this headline, and you can go and look at this if you want to. Right under this headline is a TW trigger warning that says homophobia, transphobia. And I think that's very interesting. It's very interesting that this article about being safe in a church for the LGBT community, written for the LGBT community, has a trigger warning in the article. Is that not ironic for anybody else? All right, we'll just move on from that. So this is just an interesting thing that we're going to see more and more as it goes on. So I want to just include some of this and we'll talk about this. So they've been listening to messages. They've been visiting some of these churches. They've been scouring the websites. And we're told, as I just read, St. Eldad's Church and St. Ebbe's Church are in the lowest rate. So the next paragraph says this, quote, the introduction to the report states it's intended to give LGBTQ people the tools to make informed decisions about what churches to attend. It acknowledged that while all churches should be welcoming places and spaces for LGBTQ plus people of faith, That is not the case. And this is still a quote. It's important to help prevent queer people experiencing trauma caused by, another quote, spiritual abuse. So I'm going to continue on a little bit of a quote here. A spokesperson from the group told us, this is the newspaper talking about it, for a long time, students in Oxford have walked into churches not knowing how their LGBTQ identity will be received. Continue on the quote. We desperately want to stop this from happening, and this is what our report attempts to do. End quote. Okay. So this is the idea that this community can never, should never, must never hear anything against their lifestyle, against their values, against their worldview. And that means, as I'm sitting here next to the Bible, they can't hear passages from the Bible. If you started reading parts of 1 Corinthians or Ephesians or Jesus in some of his sermons, you wouldn't be able to read that because it is contrary to what they say. So this is biblical Christianity. This goes against the LGBT ideal of quote unquote safety. It causes actual harm in their ideals. So what do we do? Their sexual identity, their gender expression, their sexual expression is not aligned with the morality of the Bible. And it goes beyond that, of course. The morality of the Bible isn't intentionally specific towards this community. Any sex outside of marriage, any relations beyond that are specifically against the biblical morality. And of course, we know that. It just happens to be interesting in a twisted way that this particular group, this particular community has raided churches to see if they are quote unquote safe for this community. Continuing on with this article, quote, from the position of LGBTQ people of faith who hold affirming, inclusive theology and pastoral practice, the definition of those who hold the traditional beliefs of the Church of England can include numerous churches and denominations. Importantly, an affirming theological perspective of the traditional view of marriage is that it is not, in fact, a form of ancient orthodoxy, but in most cases, this is still a quote, an example of systemic homophobic theology from post-World War II USA, end quote. Okay, so that was a lot of gobbledygook to say. Their idea about biblical morality. So when the Bible says in Genesis 1, for instance, that it's not good for man to be alone, so God creates woman, thereby creating the first marriage, and man and woman are told to go and be fruitful and multiply, therefore creating the first family. Their argument is that is not where family comes from, this natural biblical family. They argue the invention of the nuclear family, man, woman, child, comes from the boomers and the busters of the end of World War II. It's a capitalist invention out of the mold of oppression towards someone from the end of World War II. I don't know what to do with this, people. Actually, I was listening to, I should have clipped this for you. Vodi Bakum has a great talk about this, so I'm giving him full credit for this idea. But this is really good, and I'm going to paraphrase here from memory. You can go and watch it, and he obviously does it much better than I do. But he tells this great story about the oppression of marriage and how we are told here, in fact, as well, that getting married is oppressive to women. And he tells this great story, which again, I'm going to fumble here, about this whole idea of, hey, before marriage, men would go around sleeping with whoever they want and creating as many children with as many women as they want. And then one day, this man has this idea to make it better for men. And so he says, here's what we're going to do. Instead of going to any woman you want and having children with any woman you want, we're going to create this compact. We're going to create this agreement with one woman. And not just that, you're going to then be committed to this one woman for your whole life and commit to raising those children together so that they can grow and flourish and be as good as they can, this one woman and the children that you create in this relationship. And that's the joke, right? The joke is that's oppressive. The oppression is to commit and pour into a family versus just going from person to person and living a lifestyle that is just completely lavish and doing whatever you want to whoever you want, whenever you want. But the oppression is raising a family together. This is just the joke that people have bought into from a feminist perspective that said being married is oppressive and raising a family together is oppressive, whereas it actually is the most encouraging and wonderful and, may I add, biblical model in the history of the world. But back to this article claiming that the normal idea of marriage, man, woman, child, and family, comes from the end of World War II is just a dumb claim. Like literally, it's dumb. There is no historical evidence for this claim. I mean, a cursory glance at all of history reveals that marriage and family have been the core of civilization for pretty much all of history. But this is being written in a newspaper for and by the people of Oxford College. Oxford College. You don't accidentally go to Oxford College. It's one of the most competitive academic institutions probably in the world at this point. One of, at least ostensibly, the most respected universities in the world. And yet these people who are at Oxford, writing for Oxford, are saying the normal family, man and woman and child, comes from the end of World War II. I literally, like, that is a dumb claim. I'm not saying they're dumb people, but that's not a smart claim. That's not a historical claim. It's not. It literally comes from out of nowhere. They're making this claim that the union of a man and a woman in an exclusive lifetime monogamous relationship, as I described, is something that was invented in the United States after World War II. So it was an imported thing to Britain that the United States, as the patriarchal oppressor, just exported to the rest of the world to destroy women and the LGBTQ community. Apparently, that's what they're saying. Again, whatever. Let's just talk about the rating system a little bit, and we'll kind of land this plane. So the organizers of this report say they wanted to use something like a traffic light system in order to give affirmation or warning to the LGBTQ students at Oxford. The categories start at level 1, and level 1 is the worst, which, by the way, isn't level 1 usually the best? Whatever, I didn't make this up. So the color of level 1, of course, is red. And the statement there is, quote, "This is probably a church where there is a public teaching calling homosexuality sinful. They're likely to use the clobber passages," this is reading, "to argue that any form of homosexual sex within a same-sex marriage or otherwise is a form of sexual immorality, and are likely to use this as a means of arguing for celibacy or conversion to a heterosexual lifestyle. It's also likely that trans and non-binary people are not openly affirmed," end quote. That sounds like the Bible, but let's keep going. To this red level 1 grade, the writers at the college said, quote, "We believe for some people, especially freshmen, and students, it may mean a high risk of spiritual abuse." Okay, so they're warned, and they're warning students and freshmen about level 1. Very, very bad. So again, 1 bad, 5 good. 2 is also bad. I believe also red. So even though it's a stoplight, it goes red, red, yellow, green, green, or the other way. I don't know. This rating system doesn't make any sense to me, but this is the rating system. So number 2, quote, "In this church," number 2 church, "a diversity of sexuality is probably rarely mentioned. They have a heteronormative approach to life," end quote. Okay, listen. Anytime you hear heteronormative, it just means man marries a woman and they have a baby and a family. Again, the definition of family for all of human history. So if you... I'm starting to lose it here. So if you have a family, man, woman, child, and you talk about it in a church, red, bad. This is bad rating. Can't talk about that at church. This is, and even level 2, like notice, this is even, so level 1 was the church teaches that immorality outside of marriage is bad. Level 2 is just that there are man, woman, children in there. They're not even necessarily even teaching that it's bad. It's just that they don't actually say it out loud. So that's actually kind of a problem. And what I mentioned at the beginning, silence is not going to get you through this. Not addressing this is not going to get you through this. Pretending that the LGBTQ cult exists and ignoring it completely is not going to get you through this. That's an important point to note, and we'll talk about more of that in a minute. So by the time you get to 5, you are at 100% support, rainbows and banners and flags, and everything is everywhere. We love everybody, probably being led by a drag queen, as we saw on the show last time. That's probably what's happening. Of course, in the middle is a yellow or amber, I believe they refer to in this chart, because they're Europe or England and they do things differently. So number 3, right in the middle, quote, in this church, it's likely sexuality and relationships of any kind are not mentioned. Heterosexuality and cisgender experience is the passively assumed norm. I'll pause there and say, again, that's just normal people. So man, woman, child. If you're a man and you know you're a man, that's apparently cisgendered. Continuing on the quote, minister may personally either unsure of the theological stance on matters related to LGBTQ people, or they may be personally affirming when asked, but disinclined to speak publicly about it, end quote. So note again, number 3, which is in the middle, yellow, a little bit dangerous, is the minister, I was going to say himself, but at this point, can you even guess that? I don't know. The minister may even say to you, oh yeah, I totally affirm this lifestyle, but I just won't say it publicly. So silence is not going to buy you anything. Even passive acceptance is not going to buy you anything. They're still coming for you. Number 4, quote, this is a church where there's at least some public support where LGBTQ people and probably a specific public are welcome. Leaders are likely to be prepared to voice their affirmation, and they may occasionally preach or write a blog or magazine article to explain their theological position. There will be LGBTQ people in the congregation, maybe positions of leadership, agencies, resources, which offer LGBTQ people support and allyship, and linked and promoted, end quote. Now, I'm going to even pause there for a second and say, you could be writing blogs, you could be loving people and showing that you're just all full in support, but you're still a number 4. This is a rough list. Okay, number 5, quote, this is probably a church which has internalized a queer identity. It may be that a large number of LGBTQ plus people attend or even even they started or lead the church. Straight and cis people attend as part of the diversity rather than the assumed norm. If someone were to speak against inclusivity, others would defend it. I'm just going to pause there again and say, so it's not just the leaders of the church that are saying the LGBT cult is the way. Members of the cult will pile on top of you and destroy you and banish you if you voice other views that are against the cult, which I keep saying cult very intentionally, because if that doesn't sound like a cult to you, that's a cult. All right. Continuing on, quote, LGBTQ plus relationships and milestones are publicly celebrated. Driving through a green light, you can be far more certain the road will be clear and, here's the word, safe to drive, end quote. Stoplights, driving. Yeah, it's funny. So they, in this article, talk about a bunch of other churches, a member of the Church of England. They talk about this person, an associate member, Simon Ponsonby's podcast, which is called apparently Unscripted. It is advertised. It is supported by St. Aldadi's that we mentioned earlier. He, Ponsonby, and I apologize, I'm probably mispronouncing that, says that any sex outside of a lifelong marriage between a husband and wife is an impurity. Correct. That's the biblical model, Jesus model, Paul's model, Peter's model. I mean, I could give you verse after verse after verse. We could go back in time and talk about Solomon before he fell and made a bunch of bad decisions. David before he did a bunch of bad decisions. I mean, it is super clear across the entirety of Scripture that any sex outside of a lifelong marriage between a husband and a wife is an impurity. Yes, but apparently in this case and in this rating system, that's really, really bad. So all of this is the biblical truth, the biblical value that churches and Christians have held for 2,000 plus years. And it is, in this instance, a really bad thing. And that's the point to look out for here. So That church that we just referenced, St. Aldate's, is number one, which is the worst in this scale. They wrote about it, quote, St. Aldate's in particular, its leadership has a history of campaigning against LGBTQ plus relationships and identities. The church has tried to remain silent on LGBTQ relationships since the arrival of Reverend Stephen Foster. Church leadership are unlikely to affirm LGBTQ people and may expect them to live celibate lives, end quote. Again, I've got to focus in on this word in that article, silent. The church is bad, they say, because it tries to remain silent on these issues. Think about that. Imagine this nationwide registry like Yelp for churches or something like that rails on biblically moral churches and churches that, quote unquote, try to remain silent. My point here is you cannot ignore this. You can't pretend it's not happening. You can't try to quote unquote love people by not speaking truth in scripture to them. It's not going to be enough. They're they are requiring you to not condemn any sexual morality at all. And they're requiring you even above that to celebrate whatever sexual immorality they do. This is where we're going. Even if your church tries to remain silent, it's not going to matter. They're going to come for you. They're going to come for your church, for your congregation, unless you celebrate their sexual immorality. You will be banished from this culture. And you'll say to me, Matt, this is a long way away. This is never going to happen. And I'll give you this example as a cross example. Look at how fast this transgender thing has gone from nobody knew anything about it to it's taking over the world. This will happen just as fast and probably sooner than you think. You need to figure out now what you're going to do when it comes to your church, when it comes to your congregation. When you find out that your congregation is listed on a website as a church to avoid, what is your church going to say? Will you bow down to this culture or will you stay true to the Bible and to Christ? Because really, those are the only two options. There's no neutral, there's no middle ground, there's no silent. There is Christ or culture. And I hope that this is not discouraging for you, because this is just the way that Christianity has been in the world for almost all of 2,000 years, save for maybe the last couple hundred. It really has been this way forever. It's just that we had a golden age where people didn't come for you if you followed Jesus. They're kind of starting to now. It's not that bad. I can acknowledge that at the moment. However, you really need to internalize your faith now. That's why we talk about living out your faith. You really need to figure out what you're going to say now, because if you don't, you're going to have one of these Peter moments. And what I mean by that is, some of you know the story of Peter. Some of you know the story arc of Peter. Jesus comes to Peter and says, follow me. And Peter says, yes, that's great. Then there's this moment in Peter's life where he says, listen, Jesus, I will follow you anywhere. I'll follow you to death. And this happens to be right before the crucifixion of Christ. And Jesus says to Peter, hey, you don't maybe know this, but you're going to deny me completely. Not even once, but 3 times. 3 times you're going to deny that you even know me. Peter's like, I would never do that. And of course, we know the story in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and know that Peter did that. He denied Christ 3 times. Then Peter writes these great books. We have them recorded as 1st and 2nd Peter in the Bible. If you're looking, they're near the end of your Bible. And you should read them. They're fantastic. In these books, he writes about how you need to live in a holy way. And he writes a lot in these books about how the culture around you is going to really persecute you for following after Christ. He learned his lesson. He changed his life. He became the rock on which the church was built, that Jesus said, your name is going to be not Simon, it's going to be Peter. You're the rock on which I build this church. This is the story arc of Peter's life, and we live something like it. I'm not saying the same. I don't hear that. I'm just saying you're going to have a moment, you're going to have a point where this culture is going to come to you and say, do you know that guy? Do you know this Jesus? And you have the choice of either acting like Peter initially and saying, oh, no, I don't know him. I've never seen him before. Or like Peter later in life, who ultimately was killed because he said, yes, Jesus is my Lord and my Savior, and I'm going to follow him all of the way. You're going to have to make that choice. This is one of those examples that I think really points to the culture completely turning against the church, against the Christian, but more than anything else, against Christ. So who are you going to serve? The culture or Christ? You're going to have to choose. For Church Public, I'm Matt Odegaard, and I hope that you will keep the faith. And thanks again for being part of Church Public. I really appreciate you. If you haven't already, hit the like, the subscribe, the share button, give a review, send this to your friend if this is helpful. I want you to be able to know how to live your life, keep the faith, and follow after Jesus with your heart and soul and mind and strength. We'll see you next time.